I'm Sylvia from Vintage Kitchen Vixen, where I share tips for simple living, creating memorable gatherings, and preparing wholesome and traditional recipes with a vintage twist. And today I'm going to be showing you how to make sauerkraut from scratch. So first thing first, I'm going to peel off the first couple layers of this head of cabbage. I actually got this on sale. And next year I want to try growing cabbage in my garden just because I love sauerkraut so much. It's actually really easy to make. I've been finding that fermented foods are growing in popularity in the Western world. I mean, ferments are super popular in Eastern countries already. Like kimchi, Koreans eat kimchi almost every day and it's so good for their health. And meanwhile, like, we're eating cooked foods all the time, or we're eating foods that are super processed. We're not eating enough raw fermented foods, not just raw foods, not just salads, because that can be a little bit hard to digest. But we don't eat enough raw fermented foods. Now, why would we want to eat more raw fermented foods? Since we're focusing on sauerkraut today, we're going to be using that as the example. So sauerkraut is a naturally fermented product, and what fermentation is, it's when yeast and bacteria from the cabbage, from my hands, from the air that's in my kitchen. It's when all of that comes into contact with the sugars that are in this cabbage. And from there, the microorganisms that are in this cabbage, they're going to digest those sugars. They're going to convert them into carbon dioxide, so you're going to have that bubbly, effervescent tang that comes with fermented foods, as well as acids. So fermented foods, they're acidic, they're more acidic than they are in their raw state, and they have that effervescence, like that slight carbonation. So you get that with when you're drinking kefir, you get that when you're eating kimchi, you get that when you're eating any fermented food. Now, the benefits of eating something that's raw and fermented is that it's really good for your gut flora, for your gut health. And in a world where everything is super sterile, super sanitized, and we're getting sick almost like at every turn in the winter. Like you go into the office and one person gets sick and the next thing you know it, the whole office gets sick. Now, one thing that I notice a lot, at least where I've worked in the past, is that people are obsessed with wiping everything down when they're sick. Like people keep these things, these containers full of Lysol wipes, and they just wipe everything in the microwave, and that's not good. And you know what, there are also, most of them I would vouch are not eating raw fermented foods, which is really good for that health and for the health of your gut flora. That will strengthen your immune system and help prevent you from catching these bugs that go around every year. So really good for keeping you healthy. Another benefit of eating something fermented is that when this cabbage is fermented and it eats its own sugars and becomes something stronger and tangier and just more delicious than it is in its raw state, is that it increases in vitamin content. So for instance, it's going to have vitamin K2, and I mean, just everything is magnified. It develops kind of like a vitamin superpower when it's fermented. And also fermented foods are rich in probiotics, which again, that rolls into the whole gut health thing. Another thing about fermented foods is that they aid in digestion and they make vitamins and minerals more absorbable. And then people who eat fermented foods are shown to be happier. And I think it's with how everything in their gut is balanced. So gut health is key to overall health. There are a lot of benefits to eating fermented vegetables, and a couple books that I can recommend off the top of my head. They're anything by Sandor Alex Katz. So there is Wild Fermentation, and then he also wrote a book called The Art of Fermentation. I have another one. Oh, hold on, let me get it. I have this other one called Fermented Vegetables by Kirsten and Christopher Shockey that just goes into everything. It goes into the basics. It shows you how to ferment different vegetables, whether that's fennel, whether that's beets, whether that's making kimchi from scratch, and they just expound all of the virtues of fermented vegetables. So it's a real powerhouse of knowledge. And there's still so much that I need to learn about fermenting, but I do love eating fermented foods. I love making and I love experimenting, so it's a lot of fun. And I'm doing my best to eat something raw with every meal. So if I'm having breakfast, like I'll put on a little bit of sauerkraut on my plate or in my bowl of savory oatmeal with eggs, and it can get a little bit wild. I think it's important to have something raw with every meal, just to make it more digestible. Lastly, for this cabbage, I paid 38 cents a pound, which is really good here in Canada. That was on sale, so like I snapped up like 3 or 4 heads of cabbage to make sauerkraut. I'll be making 1 head, so that just right now they're being stored in my fridge, so they're keeping cool, and that's what cabbage is like. So it's just mostly me at home that eats the sauerkraut. My 1-year-old isn't a big fan of it, and my husband's okay, like, you know, I'll have it if you're having it, but it's not something he's the biggest fan of, but I love it and I want to eat more of it. But since it's just me, I make 1 jar of sauerkraut at a time, so this will make 1 big jar, or I think it's a gallon jar. Does that sound right? So 1 head of cabbage like this will fill 1 liter jar like this, so I think that's a 1/4 gallon. I feel like fermented foods are gaining in popularity, which is really good because we need to be eating more of them. So that means we're going to start seeing them more and more. So if you shop at natural food stores, you're already going to notice them. I saw a jar of sauerkraut available at Costco in the refrigerated section, which is where it should be. And I saw a jar of it for $12, and I was just thinking in my head, I'm like, I got this cabbage for $2. You need a little bit of salt and a little bit of elbow grease. And that's another thing. Like if you make it yourself, you can control how much salt you put in, because that's one thing that people will caution you about when it comes to fermented foods, is that there's too much salt, there's too much sodium. And if you're watching your salt, you shouldn't eat fermented foods, but you can really control that. So I mean, yes, you're making a solution brine and fermenting foods, I can see how that's a lot more saltier, but something like sauerkraut, like for this head, I'll use like less than a tablespoon to make my sauerkraut, and that's nothing. But that's just one thing to note. So you save a lot of money when you make it yourself. But I'm going to stop talking for now. I'm going to hop into silent film mode to show you how it's done. So if you are new to my channel, you're about to find out what silent film mode is right now. Alright, so I got ahead of myself. I'm not in silent film mode yet. There is one thing that I forgot to talk about, and that's the salt. So with the salt, it really doesn't matter what kind of salt that you use, but I do like using a salt that still has its mineral intact. So I'm using a Celtic sea salt. So it has it's an unrefined mineral salt. It doesn't have iodide, and I find that it's a lot better for fermenting purposes. But if you're using a more refined salt, that's fine. It's just better that you're getting those fermented foods in you. I did say that I use less than a tablespoon when I'm making my sauerkraut, but I actually don't measure my salt, so you're not getting a salt measurement from me today. So I just sprinkle in a little bit at a time. It's better to add it bit by bit, because if it's too salty, it's going to be a lot harder for you to take that salt away than it is to add a little bit more. And I find if you don't have a lot of brine, because that's one thing, you're going to be massaging this cabbage until you get this, it's wet and it's brine, and it's going to be dripping. So you're going to have this brine at the bottom of the bowl, and if you're not getting that, add a little bit more salt. But as a rule, if it tastes really good with how much salt you have on, you're going to have a really delicious sauerkraut. And if it's too salty, you're going to have a salty sauerkraut. So that's just a rule of thumb. So just add a little bit at a time, like, you know, small little sprinkle. If you want, you can start out with like half a teaspoon or a teaspoon at a time and go from there. But just do it bit by bit, do in small stages. But as a rule of thumb, like a tablespoon or less for 2 pounds of cabbage, or 1 pound. I can't weigh things, and how much is this? I don't know. I need my kitchen scale. But that's all I wanted to say about the salt. So now we're going into silent film mode for real. Okay, so I forgot one more thing. Okay, so I cut my cabbage. I peeled off the outer layers of my cabbage. I washed it. And one thing I forgot to mention that's super important, is especially if you're new to fermenting, you don't really need very much. You just need that liter jar. You need your salt. You need your arm power. You also need something to pound your kraut down. So they have kraut pounders, but I just use my rolling pin, and maybe one day I'll get a specially made pounder for that, but that's what I'm using, just to tamp everything down when I'm putting everything in the jar. There's one big rule when you're fermenting, and that is if it's covered in brine, everything's fine. Because when things are no longer submerged in brine, that's when you can get problems with mold. You don't want to see that when you're making sauerkraut, because that's when things get awry. Once this kraut is done, it's going to be sitting on a baking sheet of mine, and it's going to be just chilling out for 5 days or so, maybe 6 days. You can check it every day, and when it's sour enough for you, you can just move it over into the refrigerator, cover it up and everything. But when it's fermenting, you can get special weights for it to hold everything down. But I just fold up some cabbage leaves and I just stick it in, just to make sure that everything beneath is covered in brine. So that's what I use. You can also get special lids that help with that as well, but I don't have anything fancy yet. Maybe one day I will, but I'm just very basic right now, and I have everything that I need. Every day, just make sure that everything is covered, and because of the carbonation that is happening and the chemical process that is happening as your raw cabbage transforms into something fermented and delicious, is that your jar might overflow, which is why you want to have a baking sheet or something to catch any overflow that happens. So just be warned of that. And as a best practice, you might want to label your jar, or just leave a label so you know what date you made the sauerkraut, so that you can keep an eye on that. So that's all I have to say about that. I think I am done. So we're going to go back into silent film mode, so sorry for the interruption. Thank you so much for joining me for today's episode of Vintage Kitchen Vixen. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and if you are new here, I hope you will hit the subscribe button and the bell notification so that you never miss an episode of the kitchen. And I also hope you will like this video, leave a comment if you have something to say about fermented foods, or whether or not you've made sauerkraut before, or if you have any other experience making other krauts. Like, I know once you get started, you can really have fun and start adding different vegetables in when you're mixing up the cabbage, whether that's shredded turnip, whether that's carrots, whether that's fennel seeds, or I don't really like them, but caraway seeds. So you can experiment with the flavors as you become more and more confident with making sauerkraut and with fermenting. The sky's the limit, really, and it's so much better for your health once you get into it. So if you have any stories about whether or not you're into fermenting, or your experiences have been with fermented foods and how they've impacted your life, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Or if you're brand new to it and you've never tried it and you're curious or you're going to try this, I also hope you'll leave a comment and let me know. I just want to hear your stories. I love hearing from you, and I do my best to get back to each and every one of you. I am really touched whenever I see you take the time to say a quick word and to leave a positive comment, so I really appreciate that, and it always makes my day, so thank you so much for that. And another way you can support me, you can share this on social media if you feel so inclined. And speaking of which, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram if you want to see what I'm up to throughout the week. I'm always posting recipes and updates when I post something new, so that's one way you can follow me along on my kitchen journeys. But that's it for me for now. I do put out 2 new posts a week. That includes a video as well as a blog post, so I will be seeing you real soon. Bye! Or I think it's a gallon jar. Does that sound right? How much is a gallon? 4 liters? That doesn't sound right. It's a pint jar. I'm not good at this. It's a liter jar. 1 liter. Okay, quarter gallon. That's all I wanted to say about the salt. Oh, thank you, Big Papa. I'm getting the kitchen scale. My handy friend. I think a battery's out of here, so it doesn't work here. Okay.